What up, what up, what up? How's everybody doing? Um, how should I introduce this? Okay, so, this is the first section of the book, What Was the USSR? Towards a Theory of the Deformation of Value Under State Capitalism by Aufheben. I actually have a hard copy of this book, which was released by a group called Thought Crime Inc., which had a website, www.thoughtcrimeinc.com, at least in 2013, and it was published by Black Cat Press in Edmonton, Alberta. I don't know if this group is still in existence, or what the people involved are doing now. But the thing that I think is very cool is that this group put out a couple of pamphlets that I think were really important. I have two of them. Only I've read one of them. The one that I read was I just can't remember what it's called, but it's called like What is Capitalism? But it's by Adam Buick and John Crump, which is basically just kind of like outlines what is capitalism and what is state capitalism. It's a very, very, very good piece. It's one of my favorite things to tell people to read. But they also put out a pamphlet that was by someone named Scott Napoulos or something like that, which was like a critique of and a history of the concept of democratic centralism. But yeah, they make cool stuff. Or they made cool stuff. I'm not sure if they still exist or not, but cool stuff. Anyway, I'll read the description on the back of the book. The Russian Revolution was the subsequent establishment of the USSR as a, quote, workers' state, end quote, has dominated political thinking for more than 3 generations. In the past, it seemed enough for communist revolutionaries to define their radical separation with much of the, quote, left, end quote, by denouncing the Soviet Union as state capitalist. This is no longer sufficient, if it ever was. To transform society, we not only have to understand what it is, we have to understand how past attempts to transform society failed. In What Was the USSR, Aufheben explores the inadequacies of the theory of the USSR as a degenerated workers' state and the various versions of the theory that the USSR was a form of state capitalism. Yeah, so the contents of the book are, section 1 is the question of Russia once more. The next is titled Trotsky's Theory of the Soviet Union as a Degenerated Workers' State. Section 2 is the theory of the USSR as a form of state capitalism within Trotskyism. Russia as a non-mode of production. Left communism and the Russian Revolution. And finally, towards a theory of the deformation of value. So, this is just going to be the little introduction, which is titled The Question of Russia Once More. Introduction, The Question of Russia Once More. In August 1991, the last desperate attempt was made to salvage the old Soviet Union. Gorbachev, the great reformer and architect of both glasnost and perestroika, was deposed as president of the USSR and replaced by an 8-man junta in an almost bloodless coup. Yet within 60 hours, this coup had crumbled in the face of the opposition led by Boris Yeltsin, backed by all the major Western powers. Yeltsin's triumph not only hastened the disintegration of the USSR, but also confirmed the USA as the final victor in the Cold War that had for 40 years served as the matrix of world politics. 6 years later, all this now seems long past. under the New World (DIS) order, in which the USA remains the sole superpower. The USSR and the Cold War seemed little more than history, but the collapse of the USSR did not simply reshape the, quote, politics of the world, end quote. The collapse of the USSR has had fundamental repercussions in the, quote, world of politics, end quote, repercussions that are far from being resolved. Ever since the Russian Revolution in 1917, all points along the political spectrum have had to define themselves in terms of the USSR, and in doing so, they have necessarily had to define what the USSR was. This has been particularly true for those on the, quote, left, end quote, who have sought in some way to challenge capitalism. Insofar as the USSR was able to present itself as, quote, an actually existing socialist system, end quote, as a viable alternative to the, quote, market capitalism of the West, end quote, it came to define what socialism was. Even, quote, democratic socialists, end quote, in the West, such as those on the left of the Labour Party in Britain, who rejected the, quote, totalitarian, end quote, methods of Lenin and the Bolsheviks, and who sought a parliamentary road to socialism, still took from the Russian model nationalization and centralized planning of the commanding heights of the economy as their touchstone of socialism. The question as to what extent the USSR was socialist, and as such was moving towards a communist society, was an issue that has dominated and defined socialist and communist thinking for more than 3 generations. It is hardly surprising, then, that the fall of the USSR has thrown the left and beyond into a serious crisis. While the USSR exists in opposition, however false, to free market capitalism, and while social democracy in the West continued to advance, it was possible to assume that history was on the side of socialism. The ideals of socialism and communism were those of progress. With the collapse of the USSR, such assumptions have been turned on their head. With the victory of, quote, free market capitalism, end quote, socialism is now presented as anachronistic. The notion of centralized planning of huge nationalized industries is confined to an age of dinosaurs, along with organized working class struggle. Now it is the market and liberal democracy that claim to be the future. Socialism and communism are deemed dead and gone. With this ideological onslaught of neoliberalism that has followed the collapse of the USSR, the careerists in the old social democratic and communist parties have dropped all vestiges of socialism as they lurch to the right. With the Blairite New Labour in Britain, the Clintonite New Democrats in the USA, and the renamed communist parties in Europe, all they have left is to openly proclaim themselves as the, quote, new and improved, end quote, caring managers of capitalism, fully embracing the ideals of the market and modern management methods. Of course, for the would-be revolutionaries who had grown up since the 1960s, with the exception, of course, of the various Trotskyist sects, the notion that the USSR was in any way progressive, let alone socialist or communist, had for a long time seemed ludicrous. The purges and show trials of the 1930s, the crushing of the workers' uprisings in East Germany in 1953, and in Hungary in 1956, the refusal to accept even the limited liberal reforms in Czechoslovakia in 1968, and the continued repression of workers' struggles in Russia itself, had long led many of the, quote, revolutionary left, end quote, to the conclusion that whatever the USSR was, it was not socialist. Even the contention that, for all its monstrous distortions, the USSR was progressive, insofar as the USSR still developed the productive forces, became patently absurd as the economic stagnation and the waste of the Brezhnev era became increasingly apparent during the 1970s. For those ultra-leftists and anarchists who had long since rejected the USSR as in any way a model for socialism or communism, and who as a result had come to reassert the original communist demands for the complete abolition of wage labor and commodity exchange, it has long since become self-evident that the USSR was simply another form of capitalism. As such, for both anarchists and ultra-leftists, the notion that the USSR was state capitalist has come as an easy one, too easy perhaps. If it was simply a question of ideas, it could have been expected that the final collapse of the USSR would have provided an excellent opportunity to clear away all the old illusions in Leninism and social democracy that had weighed like a nightmare on generations of socialist and working class militants. Of course, this has not been the case, and if anything, the reverse may be true. The collapse of the USSR has come at a time when the working class has been on the defensive, and when the hopes of radically overthrowing capitalism have seemed more remote than ever. If anything, as insecurity grows with the increasing deregulation of market forces, and as the old social democratic parties move to the right, it would seem, if anything, that the conditions are being laid for a revival of, quote, old-style socialism, end quote. Indeed, freed from having to defend the indefensible, old Stalinists are now taking new heart and can now make common cause with the more critical supporters of the old Soviet Union. This revivalism of the old left, with the Socialist Labour Party in Britain as the most recent example, can claim to be making just as much headway as any real communist or anarchist movement. The crisis of the left that followed the collapse of the USSR has not escaped communists or anarchists. In the past, it was sufficient for these tendencies to define their radical separation with much of the, quote, left, end quote, by denouncing the Soviet Union as state capitalist and denying the existence of any actually existing socialist country. This is no longer sufficient if it ever was. As we shall show, many Trotskyists, for example, now feel vindicated by the, quote, restoration of capitalism, end quote, in Russia. Others, like Tikhtin, that's Hillel Tikhtin, who was the main editor of the journal Critique, which offered a lot of critical analysis of the USSR. Tikhtin himself being a Trotskyist, but other people are writing in the journal, not the consistent stable of people that wrote in that journal, but they had space in that journal for a more libertarian critique. So like people like Lauren Goldner would be in there, Maurice Brinton was in there at some points, other people that were of a more libertarian persuasion also wrote in Critique from time to time. And I think Critique's still in operation today. It's a very important journal in the history of analysis of the Russian question. Any hooser. Others, like Tikhtin, have developed a more sophisticated analysis of the nature of the old USSR, what caused its eventual collapse, which has seriously challenged the standard theories of the USSR as being state capitalist. While some anarchists and ultra-leftists are content to repeat the old dogmas concerning the USSR, most find the question boring, a question they believe has long since been settled. Instead, they seek to reassert their radicality in the practical activism of prisoner support groups. Parenthesis, quote, the left never supports its prisoners, does it, end quote, end parenthesis. Or in the theoretical pseudo-radicality of primitivism. For us, however, the question of what the USSR was is perhaps more important than ever. For so long as the USSR was presented, both by socialists and those opposed to socialism, as the only feasible alternative to capitalism, for the vast majority of people, the failure and collapse of the USSR has meant the failure of any realistic socialist alternative to capitalism. The only alternatives appear to be different shades of, quote, free market, end quote, capitalism. Yet it is no good simply denouncing the USSR as having been a form of state capitalism on the basis that capitalism in any form of society is any form of society we don't like. And that's a very important statement here. Yet it is no good simply denouncing the USSR as having been a form of state capitalism on the basis that capitalism is any form of society we don't like. To transform society, we have not only to understand what it is, we also have to understand how past attempts to transform it failed. Outline. In this issue and the next one, we shall explore the inadequacies of various versions of the theory that the USSR was a form of state capitalism. Firstly, when compared with the standard Trotskyist theory of the Soviet Union as a degenerated worker state, and secondly, and perhaps more tellingly, in the light of the analysis of the USSR put forward by Tikhtin, which purports to go beyond both state capitalism and degenerated worker state conceptions of the nature of the Soviet Union. To begin with, we shall examine Trotsky's theory of the USSR as a degenerated worker state, which, at least in Britain, has served as the standard critical analysis of the nature of the Soviet Union since the 1930s. Then we shall see how Tony Cliff, having borrowed the conception of the USSR as state capitalist from the left communists in the 1940s, developed his own version of the theory of the USSR as a form of state capitalism which, while radically revising the Trotskyist orthodoxy with regard to Russia, sought to remain faithful to Trotsky's broader theoretical conceptions. As we shall see, as is well recognized, although through the propaganda work of the Socialist Workers' Party and its sister organizations worldwide, Cliff's version of the state capitalist theory is perhaps the most well-known. It is also one of the weakest. Indeed, as we shall observe, Cliff's theory has been often used by orthodox Trotskyists as a straw man with which to refute all state capitalist theories and sustain their own conception of the USSR as a degenerated worker state. Just as a side note, this is a comment made by, I believe, Thomas Martin. Thomas Martin is a writer with the UK group Alliance for Workers' Liberty, which, as you know, I think rather highly of. Even if I'm not a Trotskyist or a Leninist, I think in terms of Trotskyism and Leninism, they're the group that is most worthy of sympathy from a more libertarian perspective. But Thomas Martin, who's in that party, and generally the Alliance for Workers' Liberty is, being a third camp organization. Their tradition comes from people like Shachtman and Joseph Carter, then Hal Draper and so forth, who had a bureaucratic collectivist thesis on the USSR. Within their ranks, Thomas Martin, I believe, holds that the USSR was in fact state capitalist. And I think he makes the point. I have articles of him on the channel, and I haven't listened to them in a while, and I should listen to them again because they're very good, if I remember correctly. But he argues that, he makes the same point that, the theory of state capitalism in the USSR is not reducible to the particular version of that thesis put forward by Tony Cliff. So I'll repeat the last sentence. Indeed, as we shall observe, Cliff's theory has often been used by orthodox Trotskyists as a straw man with which to refute all state capitalist theories and sustain their own conceptions of the USSR as a degenerated worker state. In contrast to Cliff's theory, we shall, in the next issue, consider other, perhaps less well-known versions of the theory of the USSR as state capitalist that have been put forward by left communists and other more recent writers. This will then allow us to consider Tichtin's analysis of the USSR and its claim to go beyond both the theory of the USSR as a state capitalist and the theory of the USSR as a degenerated worker state. Having explored the inadequacies of the theory that the USSR was a form of state capitalism in the light of both the Trotskyist theory of the Soviet Union as a degenerated worker state and, more importantly, Tichtin's analysis of the USSR, we shall, in Aufheben 8, seek to present a tentative restatement of the state capitalist theory in terms of a theory of the deformation of value. The end. Thank you for listening.